So after we deflask our cases, they'll look like something like this, if you recall from the last video. Now I do have a little bit of flash of acrylic over the occlusal surface, which of course is going to interfere with milling in the bite. So you can take a fine pick or any type of instrument and carefully pick this out, because this will not allow the bite to come together to equilibrate. So I'll pick it off as much as I can. And I got a little bit on this side as well. So a fine pick works well here. Careful not to chip any of the teeth, of course. And I got a little bit of stone back here. So that looks pretty good. A bit of a projection here that I can just simply trim it out. Let's go to the lower. Not so much here. And this side looks pretty clean. So I can hand articulate these together to see if there's any interference whatsoever with any other parts. It looks pretty good. It looks like I can put it together fairly easy, but we'll have a better sense of on the articulator. So we need to remount these models back on our mounting rings. We have one here for the upper, and you want to make sure that there's no separator or any stone debris on the back of these casts, because that'll prevent the model from sitting properly back on the mounting. And that looks pretty good. And the fact that we had a nice smooth border here gives us a good visual how things are going to come together. So that's pretty good. If you recall from the complete upper and lower videos, we tagged things together with some separator, and we also made some mechanical retention on the side. I'm not going to do that for this video, just to show you a variation, but I suggest you do that. And of course, you build this up with plaster as well as on the other side. Okay. So I got some separator here. Make sure that the separator is not dehydrated excessively, otherwise it'll be too thick and it'll create a spacing. So an ample amount of separator, and then squeeze everything together, and you can see the excess separator coming out the side. And I can simply just wipe that with the Kleenex. So that looks pretty good. Do the same thing to the lower. Again, make sure there's no debris whatsoever, no separator. And just assess how things come together. There's no rocking. I have a nice positive seating of the cast back onto the mounting, so that looks pretty good. Now, when you set it down, don't put it upside down, because you might pick up some debris that might be on the bench. Leave it upright, or leave it face down. A little bit of separator there. And squeeze everything together. If you have your mounting on your articulator, you're going to have a hard time doing this. So do this procedure while the mounting is off the articulator. And that looks pretty good too. If you don't remount it properly, obviously you're going to be selective grinding in the wrong bite. So it's very important that you do this correctly. Okay, now back to our articulator. And put everything back on here. And see how everything comes back together. Obviously there's an open bite. This articulator was used previously. I believe we had a 0 opening there, so it's quite a bit open. You can visually assess where it's hitting together before you start milling in, just to reduce some of your time. And of course back here where I had the little projection earlier. Okay. So we're going to use multiple equipment here. We're going to use our lathe eventually, but in the beginning we're going to use our handpiece. And I'm just going to use a small burr, somewhat. You can use a round burr, such as this, or something very similar. This is a little finer, so I'll get a finer finish versus this is a little more coarse, as you can see there. So I'm going to use the one on the right. And I'm going to start trimming away that little projection and see if my bite closes a little bit better, which is right here. Got a little bit of a investment here. Very carefully not to grind the prosthetic teeth. And I'll grind this little spot here too. I wasn't able to pick it. Now, if by any chance, while deflasking the case, you couldn't salvage your master cast, it would be impossible to do this procedure. You wouldn't be able to remount them back on the mountings and place them back on the articulator to start milling in the bite. And the bite is already closed up much, much better. Okay, if that was the case, what could you do? Well, if you recall, we did make duplicate models of these, which we're going to use to retrofit this case to ensure we have a proper fit on the models, at least, before we get to the patient. And if you recall, I still have my bite block that I used to mount the master cast. So if you weren't able to salvage the master cast after deflasking, you could remount the duplicate models. And after you retrofit on the duplicate models, you can check the bite in here, if you had to. And I don't think this will be the case, but what if in life? Okay, I'll set those aside and continue. Now I can take some articulating paper. This is 80 microns. You can certainly use something thinner, but 80 is sufficient. And there's a single strip here, and there's a U-shaped strip as well. So I'm going to place it in between and gently tap together to see if we have any indication of any high spots. And there's quite a few. There's one right here. There's one here. There's some here. And pretty much on the occlusal on the lower, which is to be expected. So I'm going to start grinding away a little bit of, and even if you have to grind the tooth a little bit, it's quite okay. Because we're going to reduce this apron down a little bit anyways. Remember, we overextended the apron to block out the undercuts on the lingual side before we invested it. So this apron is slightly higher than it should be. So I'm going to gently just kind of trim the inside a little bit to prevent any further interference, but still maintain the height of the cusp tips. So I know where it fits up against the lower. So let's see if this made any difference at all. Much better. We're getting closer. Now as I'm getting closer, I'm just going to take the single strip and just tear it in half. And I also like to wipe off the articulating paper indentation or imprint in between passes. And see where else we have interference. So I have a little interference up here on the apron, as you can see it there. And we're going to be cutting this apron down quite a bit anyhow. So, and again, if you happen to touch the tooth, it's quite okay, because these models are going to be just eliminated eventually, and we're going to be using the duplicate models. Where else? Maybe a little bit here. And a little bit here possibly. I'm not going to work on the lowers yet. I'm just trying to eliminate the interference of the apron all along here. And let's see how much closer together we are now. Much better. So we can see this case is starting to close up nicely. The pin is almost together. So we're going to keep going some more. So gentle taps, because if you get too aggressive, you might break off some of the teeth, or the cusp tips, and that's not good. So a little more on the apron here. A little bit right here. And again, I'm preserving the cusp tips because I need those for the bite. I'm doing everything that I can possibly do to ensure that when it comes to the insertion appointment, this fits very well, and I'm minimizing the adjustments that I have to do chairside. It's a lot easier to do them in the lab than it is to do them chairside. See if there's any interference here. Maybe a little bit back here on the lingual side. I'm just going to put a little separator, or wax remover I should say, not separator, and just wipe everything clean. You can see some of the residue that comes off. And keep going and see how well we are with this. Much better. It just gets better every time you do it. But I certainly don't hear that distinctive sound of having stone to stone contact yet. I don't. And the pin is still slightly open. So I'm going to keep going with this. Let's see where we are now. Still a little bit here. So hopefully you didn't have too much of a difference in the bite. Otherwise, you're going to be grinding a lot of the occlusals off the teeth, and you're going to be eliminating a lot of the anatomy on the teeth. That's starting to sound a little bit better. Pin is getting a little closer together, so I'm on the right track. And again, I don't like doing this, placing the whole thing in here and doing that, because you're going to get a lot of imprints of the articulating paper, and it gives you a false sense of the bite. And I think if you use small strips, it's a lot better. Still a little bit here. And a little bit here. Lots of room here. I know this apron is going to be trimmed down much lower than what it is here. How we're doing on the lower. Typically, just like a complete denture, you're going to have interference mostly around the molar area. And try to use a burr that's relatively smooth. As you can see, this one here is kind of smooth, or at least a lot smoother than the one on the left. This will create a lot of roughness, whereas this one, you'll grind the teeth a little bit smoother. Let's see how everything comes together again. Much nicer. Pin is getting really close now. So this takes a little bit of time, and if you do it correctly, providing that the bite was correct, you're going to have very, very little adjustments chair side, and that's what I'm aiming for. Bit of a acrylic there, trying to pick that out. There we go. So that might happen, and that's why we want to put some plaster on the side. But just to move things along, I'm going to go back and re-tag my model onto the mounting. But just make sure that it's free of any debris, because if I don't remount it correctly, I'm grinding in the wrong bite. And tag it back together. Wipe off the excess. And hopefully I'll be a little more gentle with it this time so it doesn't separate. But I think for good measure and good practice, if you put those keyways on the side and place some plaster there, you won't have this issue. The pin is about 1/2 millimeter open, which equates to about maybe less than 1/4 back here. So I'm very close, but not there yet. So not only visually, I don't think things are back together, but just from the sound, I can tell that I don't have stone-to-stone contact. I have a little bit of plaster here from the investment. I hope you can pick that up on camera, ever so slightly, because that's going to interfere. I missed that. So make sure you clean off the occlusal surfaces well from any acrylic and investment. Let's see if that made a difference. Not so much. Let's see where we might have interference, possibly a little bit here, but mostly down here. Wipe everything clean with a little bit of wax remover and bring things back together. Still a little open. It's going to tap just a little bit harder, not much. Make sure you catch the interior portion here in case there's any interference here. It doesn't look like it. And it's mostly with the lower posteriors. When you're grinding, don't just spot grind, but really cradle the area so you round things off a little bit. So you're just not, you know, digging holes into the tooth, so to speak. That's a little bit closer. Just going to check the occlusal here, make sure there's nothing else here. A little bit of separator there. Possibly there might be an interference right here, so I'm just going to trim that off. Even though I'm trimming a little bit of the stone surface a little bit. Taper this down. And a little bit in here. Wipe everything clean. Let's see how things come together again. Starting to sound much better. The intercuspation of the teeth look very good. Looking at it from the back. Not sure if you see it properly on camera. Things are looking pretty much together. I'm going to go a little bit more. Let's see if there's any interference up here whatsoever. It looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit back here, just for good measure. Again, preserve the height of the cusp tips. And I'm trying to round things off and preserve as much as the anatomy as possible. And that sounds pretty good. Have a nice positive fitting of the centric. My pin is back at 0. If you recall, during investing I had a little bit of a tooth that chipped off here. Well, we'll work around that when we trim the case. So the last thing, once you're satisfied with centric, we're going to check excursions. And if you recall, during our setup, we had what we like to call group function. And right now the canine is a little bit high. It's prematurely touching before the natural teeth are touching here. So I'm going to place my articulating paper in between. Just kind of clench things together and move it over to that side, and hopefully nothing will fall apart here. So there we go. We have a little bit of an interference right here on the lingual of the canine. So at an angle to minimize reducing the overall length of the tooth, I'm going to reduce that interference. I can't reduce this. This is the natural tooth, and there's that interference there as well. We'll check it again. And that's much better. So I can see now that these teeth are coming together much closer. We'll do that one more time. Again, wipe it in between. And I'll reverse the color of the paper this time. And that feels a whole lot smoother when I do that. I don't sense that interference there as much as I did before. But nevertheless, there is some. Right here. So at an angle, gently we're going to grind that a little bit. Doesn't take much. So work in small increments so you don't overgrind the teeth. And that feels a whole lot smoother now. Very good. So I'm going to lock this side and then work on the other side for working and balancing. And this side looks actually very good. I don't see any interference. I can see these two coming together. This should have came together, but I think there's a little chip on the tip of this tooth. But definitely this is together. So there's no interference there. So the last thing to check is protrusive, and I can remove the pin for this one so we can get a better view. Now, the fact that the left central had chipped off during processing doesn't really help me much here. And I had a little bit of a chip here too. So in this scenario, I could take a chance here in saying leave it and do a little bit of selective grinding with the patient. I can check it and verify this in the patient's mouth, remove the partials and trim them obviously extraorally, or mount my duplicate casts and verify all these movements again. But I'm going to leave it for now because it looks pretty good, because I'm missing a little bit of a tooth surface here and a little bit here. So I think by experience this should be okay. So once we do our selective grinding in centric and lateral excursions, now we are ready to remove our case from the master cast and retrofit everything to our duplicate models. But before you do, what I suggest you do, and what I like to do, is trim back the apron, the lingual aprons, as much as you can here. So this is a bit of a guessing game, and this is the hard part, because you want to trim it back, but not over trim it. Because if you do, you're going to go below the height of contour, and then you're going to create a space. So I hope this shows well on camera. So now I have to have a good sense of where the height of contour is. or at least where I marked it. Careful not to grind your wire. And obviously I'm grinding the cast, the teeth on the cast, which is perfectly okay because I don't need this model anymore. You can use a taper burr like this, or you can use an egg burr like that. I prefer something like this, but either or will work. So I'll do the other side, get a little closer to the camera. So as you can see a definite outline now of the apron. And hopefully you'll have a good sense of the height of contour, and you'll be on it or maybe just above it. Be very careful around the clasps, not to grind the clasps. This particular burr is a carbide burr, so it will grind metal very easily. So as you can see, I have a well-defined apron here now. All around. I can certainly take this part down as well. I'll do a little bit here, but I'll do this interior apron mostly when I take it off the model. Here's a little bit of that investment mishap that I have, so I'm going to be very careful here not to overgrind things, certainly not to overgrind the prosthetic tooth right up against the contact area, because that's going to create a space, and it's right front and center. So hopefully things will fit properly on the duplicate model, and I won't have to fill in any spaces or diastemas. Taper this down a little bit. So I'm going to do some trimming on this model as much as I can, since I have a nice base to hold on to. A bit of a concavity into approximately here with my burr. Here as well. And I'm tapering the apron a little bit towards the superior border, so everything is nice and tapered towards the tooth. Same thing on this side. We're going to work some more on this area after we remove it from the master cast, but just trying to get a sense of the overall contour now. That looks pretty good. So I'll move on to the lower. Again, reduce the apron here at the height of contour or slightly above it. So hopefully you had a good visual of your case while you were working on it, and not to reduce it excessively now. Hopefully I haven't. And around this tooth. Just enough. And I'll do a little bit with the interior apron, although this apron is going to be reduced a little bit further. At the height of the cingulums, or just above it. But right now, I'm purposely leaving it a little bit higher, so I can trim it back some more after I remove it from the cast. It's a little bit easier to see that. Okay. Now we have to remove these acrylic tags that we used earlier to secure the clasps for processing. So what I'm going to use for that, I'm going to use a rubber wheel. Whether it's green or blue, it doesn't make a big difference. Fairly low speed, and I'm going to try to get close to the clasp, but not touch the clasp. If you do, you're going to thin out the clasp, so you got to be careful. This rubber wheel will wear out metal. It's supposed to polish metal. So try to get close to it. As much as you can. So basically I'm thinning out the acrylic tag as much as possible. And then when I get relatively close or thin it enough, I'm just going to take a pick and carefully pick out the acrylic. Just like that. Because I had a little space between the tag and the actual wax up, if you recall, this tag did not bind or bond with this acrylic base, so it's a little easier for me to remove it, and that's the reason why. Let's do the same thing on the other side, and you can clearly see here that space that I'm talking about, right? Can I use a burr to do this? Yes, you can. Problem is, if you pinch through the acrylic and touch the clasp, you're going to do more damage with a burr than you will with this rubber wheel. And I am using a foot control now, so as I'm getting closer to the clasp, I'm reducing my RPMs. Just in the event that I do touch the clasp, I don't damage it excessively. Again, that looks pretty good. And I'm just going to pick that out, just pry it out carefully, just like that. And the clasp is still intact, and I didn't bend it out of shape. That's kind of important as well. So let's finish up with the top ones here. And thin out this side as well, and pry them all together at the same time. So you can see I've gotten very close to the clasp there, but I didn't touch the clasp. So So let's see if this comes out as easily as the other ones. Careful now, because I got a big piece here that I don't pry the acrylic and bend the clasp out of shape. So you got to pry it in a way that it leaves the clasp intact around the tooth, just like that. Same thing here. And the last one here. Thin this out some more. This one's a little more difficult. Isn't that the case? The last one is always a little more difficult. And as you can see, I'm trying to pry this out, but the acrylic has adhered to the model. Don't over pry it, because you're going to bend your clasps out of shape. If you do, you can certainly bend them back into shape when you fit them on your duplicate model, of course. Here we go. Should come out now. Okay, so I've exposed all of my clasps, and now I am ready to chisel this out. So I'm going to stop the video now, and in another video you're going to see how I'm going to use a pneumatic chisel or an air chisel to gently chisel the acrylic bases off the master cast. I don't have any more use for the master cast, so you know they'll turn into 1,000 pieces, so to speak. But I do have my duplicates that I can work on and retrofit these cases.